I remember when my grandson Owen was just a toddler and he wanted a cookie, and so he put in his request, "Cookie, Mommy?" My daughter-in-law responded, "What's the magic word?" And Owen said, "Please." And after giving him the cookie, my daughter asked, "Now what do you say?" And her son said, "Thank you." That's the way we teach children good manners, isn't it? We teach the magic words, please and thank you. So, is that why Jesus praises the cured Samaritan leper? Because he had good manners to say thank you? Is this a good etiquette lesson for us Christians? I think there's a whole lot more involved than just that. I think it has less to do with etiquette and much more to do with gratitude and thanksgiving. A whole lot is involved in this man's cure of leprosy. Back then, leprosy was the name given to all kinds of skin diseases. Only some were really Hansen's disease, which is our modern term for leprosy. The rest were various types of skin eruptions and rashes. And when the skin became disease, people called it leprosy. And the victim suffered exclusion from the community and became ritually unclean. Now, usually when a person becomes seriously ill, family and friends rush to their side to be there with them, right? Medical treatment and pain alleviation may be in the hands of professionals, but there is no comfort like the presence of loved ones. Even dying can be eased by the sight of loved ones' faces at the bedside. So, imagine the extra pain for lepers in biblical times. Even the well-to-do Naaman, who we heard about in the first reading, he experienced not only the effects of his disease, but despite his wealth and influence at court, he also got some isolation and some repugnant glances from other people. And it was much worse for those 10 lepers in the gospel reading this morning. They were not people of means and influence. They were just a band of diseased outcasts brought together by a common expulsion. We have to note that even the normal hatred between Jews and Samaritans seems to be superseded by the common bond brought on by leprosy. Their sickness was the dominating identification in their lives. They were not individuals with names and families. They were just 10 lepers. And the lepers' situation was dire. Since no one would go near them, how could they get any food or the means for daily life? And still worse, they were considered sinners. It was common thought at that time that lepers were being punished by God for the sins that they must have committed. They needed compassion. And who would give it to them? Well, this story tells us that Jesus notices them. He is approachable. He bridges the distance others kept from the lepers. It is Jesus is the one who wants to heal them. And you notice the lepers, they use usual term that disciples use when they call out to Jesus. They call him Master. Maybe they saw him as one of the many healers they had heard about. But they realized that something amazing was going to be happening in their lives. They believed his healing was from God, and that Jesus was the channel for God's goodness and compassion. In the light of the notions Jesus' contemporaries had about leprosy and the links that they made between leprosy and sin, we can see the fuller effects of these cures. These lepers were not just cured physically, they were now socially acceptable. And after the required ritual purification, the healed lepers would be free to worship in their temples. Except, of course, the Samaritan. He had one more strike against him. The Samaritans were considered religious heretics, and so, being ritually contaminated, they were not fit to worship in the temple. He would have to go someplace else, to another temple of God. And so he goes to Jesus. So it is a whole lot more than etiquette that brings this man back to Christ. He is not just being a good son who does what his parents taught a child. When he turned away from others and returned, he changed the whole direction of his life. Gratitude would mark every single day to come. The Samaritan's return focuses this story for us. Jesus is more than just a healer of skin and bones. He is the one who manifests God's compassion for all of us, and for the suffering, and for the outsider. And he is also a promise. When the reign of God comes to its fullness, there will be no more disease. Sin and barriers will disappear between people. Naaman belonged to Israel's enemy, and so did the Samaritan. But God acts for both of them. In the kingdom of God, we all sit at the table. Jesus' presence, his healings, and welcome to the outsider shows that the new way of God has broken upon us. At this Eucharist, we celebrate that the kingdom is here and now, and we anticipate that day when the kingdom arrives in God's fullness. The Eucharist is a prayer of thanks offered by a people who have recognized Jesus is God's gift of healing for all of us. He has assured us that God has seen in us, in whatever place of alienation that we are, and he speaks a word of healing and welcome to us today. If we recognize and acknowledge what God has done for us, then we must live a changed life, one that is marked by Christ's own life in us. Like the leper, we are in a process of turning away from the other paths and returning back to Christ. We express gratitude in specific ways, by entering fully into prayer, by hearing and accepting the scriptural stories as our own, and by giving thanks. But our meal reminds us that like the Christ who has come to us this day, we too must be willing to minister to all, despite our differences. You remember the disciples' request for an increase of faith last week? And Father Scott reminded us of Jesus' response that they already had all the faith they needed to live out Jesus' life. Well, now we are asked to act act on that faith and be as approachable and welcoming to the outsider as Jesus was to that leper? Are we as open as he was? Are we ready to receive into our midst those rejected by the world as inadequate or unfit? It turns out that one of these very rejected souls has taught us in today's gospel about the great, open, and full embrace of our God. The healed leper has been our teacher to show us the way to acknowledge the greatness of God and offer gratitude at this Eucharist. I'll put this another way. We are all disciples. We are a people formed by the Word and called to express gratitude here at this meal and in lives that are lived in conformity to the gospel.